For if water baptism is truly a dead work, why use it at all? But again, and during Paul's day, it was still permissible to do. And even though permissible, Paul was still trying to lead those people's thoughts away from fleshly ordinances, from that fleshly ordinance, on toward better days with spiritual ordinances only. Indeed, a message that we especially need to get for ourselves today. However, that still does not explain why he also included in that list the laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and of eternal judgment. Well, let's begin our thoughts concerning these with the resurrection. 2 Timothy 2:18. Who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Firstly, and though Paul here confirms in 2 Timothy 2:18 that we should favor a resurrection, I don't see his word speaking of any natural grave openings, but rather of what happens now on the inside of us in a spiritual, very real inner resurrection. This I had gone over quite well in my book on New Jerusalem, which I'm also reading on video, because I see that the Old Testament promises of a future grave opening / resurrection had already been fulfilled on the very day that Jesus himself arose out of the tomb. Matthew 27:52-53. The graves were open. Many bodies of the saints, the Old Testament saints, which slept, arose, and they came up out of the grave after his resurrection, after Jesus' resurrection, and also on the third day, and they went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Therefore, I am equating this event with what Paul is saying in Hebrews 6:1-2, in that the doctrine of resurrection should now update in this new kingdom to match with a spiritual resurrection instead of the old grave openings that has already occurred in their past. And with that, we have another explanatory note, necessarily so I should say, for in the past. Again, for my full take on these resurrections, please see my book, New Jerusalem, the Mother of Us All, where I cover that subject thoroughly. Again, I'm reading that book in other videos. Of both the natural grave openings and of the spiritual inner resurrection, which this latter spiritual resurrection had begun for people beginning on the day of Pentecost. Again, if you want to watch my videos on New Jerusalem, it'll be easier to go to my YouTube channel because I have a playlist of each of the books, so that way you can read them or listen to them in order. It'll be easier than finding it on Facebook. They get buried as you put them on there. Now, I realize that by me just saying all of this and by throwing a single set of verses into the mix, Matthew 27:52-53, that may not be fully satisfying for the deepest of studiers. But, and as I've already said concerning Jesus' second coming, and of the kingdom coming in our future and being located at a literal natural city of Jerusalem, it's just too much to get into right now, especially since I've already gone page after page after page in explanations concerning all these resurrections in my aforementioned book, New Jerusalem. This is also true for the final judgment as well, as I had gone over that thoroughly in another book, and that was in my book, Satan, the Devil, and Hell. I'm also reading that on video, of which the last fourth of that book was spent on hell and the judgment. Please refer to those two books for deeper insights into these two very large subjects, because space in this book will not permit. Let me say that when I get on hell and the judgment, my book on Satan, the Devil, and Hell, I haven't yet got there in my videos yet, but I'm working my way toward it, because after I read this chapter, I'm going back to Satan, Devil, and Hell, and I'm going to be reading another chapter from there. So I'm making my way to it. I'll get there soon enough. Now, the same also as I'm seeing with the doctrines of the laying on of hands and of eternal judgment and punishment. How? Well, and as for the laying on of hands, I'm not equating this as to what I've heard tell of in the past, and that we don't lay hands suddenly on any man, as in either anger or even in prayer, or etc. But I do see this referring to the hands-on ministry of the Old Testament, when it came to outward carnal, ritualistic, fleshly ordinances. To do even as do some commentaries, they agree to this. Now let's look at John Gill's exposition of the Bible. This has no reference to the rite of laying on of hands by the apostles, either in private persons or officers of the church. For what was the doctrine of such a rite is not really easy to say, but rather to the rite of laying on of hands of the priest of the Old Testament and of the people upon the head of animal sacrifices. Let's look at Adam Clarke's commentary. In Old Testament sacrifices, the person bringing the victim laid his hands on its head, confessed sins over it, and then gave it to the priest to be offered to God, that it might make atonement for transgressions. But Albert Barnes, in his notes on the Bible, gives even some scriptures for us to consider in all of this. The Jews practiced the laying on of hands on a great variety of occasions. It was done when a blessing was imparted to anybody, when prayer was made for somebody, and when they offered sacrifice, they laid their hands on the head of the victim, confessing their sins. Let's go to Leviticus 16:21. Aaron shall lay both hands upon the head of the live goat, and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them upon the head of that goat, shall send him away by the hand of a fit man right into the wilderness. We also see this in Leviticus 24:14 and Numbers 8:12. Now, let's remember also that when Paul was writing his letters, even the apostles in Jerusalem were still doing animal sacrifices. We've got a whole chapter coming up in this book addressing that. So yes, these were things that he had to deal with during his own time dispensation. Look, we're reading a book that's 2,000 years old. We can't always refer to, oh, Paul was talking about exactly what I'm doing. He said laying on of hands. Well, we go to a church service today and do all. He was addressing things of the old covenant because he was trying to let them know everything got updated. So we have to keep that in mind. So from this point of view of this book, all of this really does make sense, especially when we consider that Paul was the one who had desperately, in his letter to the Hebrews, he tried desperately to convince his own countrymen to move away from all of those carnal ordinances, those fleshly rituals, even naming such as carnal in Hebrews 9:10. We especially see all of this in chapters 9 and chapter 10 of that letter of Hebrews. But even so, what about the doctrine of judgment? Though this is not really the book to get into such doctrinal teachings, for I had pointed out in an explanatory note for this chapter called In the Past, which we read during this chapter here, I've already done so quite thoroughly about the judgment and everything, of which I'm going to be getting on in my reading of Satan, the Devil, and Hell, but of course it's all spelled out in the actual handheld book. We should at least know that Paul was trying to shake folks away from certain false doctrines on the judgment, just as he was updating and re-educating people on the doctrines of the resurrection, all to fit an upcoming spiritual world without end dispensation. But instead of getting detailed into each and every issue of Paul's words here in the first two verses of Hebrews chapter 6, what I needed really to aim for was his words concerning the dead work of water baptism, to help drive that point home. So, in conclusion to my thoughts, therefore, and on water baptism being a dead work, again, please go to my book, Satan, Devil, and Hell. I get very detailed on the judgment in there and of how we're to look at that now in an updated New Testament kingdom. So, again, in conclusion to my thoughts, and on water baptism being a dead work, I began contending that with Paul's words in Hebrews 6:1-2, that he was trying to convey to his reading audience that those listed things were either those that already got fulfilled by his day, or really just before, by Jesus dying on the cross and ending the fleshly rituals, or bringing everything to a close, that Old Testament world to a close, or that they had already and completely ceased to be and were now considered to be only dead works, just as the animal sacrifices themselves were also deemed to be so by that same apostle. Let's look at Hebrews 9, 13, and 14. If the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctify the purifying of the natural flesh, that is, all those rituals of the Old Testament, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from all such dead works to serve the living God? So he's going on about the dead works again of the Old Covenant. We have, right in the middle of that explanatory note, wherein I said, to the purifying of the natural flesh. John Gill, in his exposition of the Bible, says, that is, the body, or only an external and typical way, in types, i.e. in types and shadows, but not realistically, but did not really sanctify the heart or purify and cleanse the soul from sin.